Hello, everybody. Welcome to a special edition of our podcast where we're kind of having a look at the soon to be released, hopefully in full text, defense investment plan, what it means for the United Kingdom, what it sets out, and asking some hard questions about it. I'm joined by Dave, the usual kind of co-host of this podcast. I will say we're going to do a different format here. Normally, our stuff is well, at least a little bit curated. We've not done that at all. This is relatively hot off the press. The Prime Minister just stopped speaking about an hour and a half or an hour and 45 minutes ago. So we're kind of responding to this on the fly. So this is a little bit unscripted. So if we go off in a direction that's a bit of a tangent, then we'll apologize now.
No cuff too tough.
With all of that said, with all of that said, let's get stuck in. Dave, we'll get into kind of the detail of what is in the dip in a second, but can we take a step back and can you just paint the picture of what the defense investment plan is, why it's important? And I think, one of the key questions that a lot of people are asking is, how is this related to the SDR that came out last year?
Yeah, thanks, Steve. So context for that question is a few years ago when I was wearing uniform, one of the jobs that I did was worked in the Secretariat team on what we refer to as the fifth floor of the Ministry of Defence. So the Ministry of Defence building in Whitehall clearly has a number of floors and different things happen on those 4 floors. So the fifth floor is where, as we described it, the grown-ups hang out. So that's the Secretary of State, the ministers, the Chief of Defence Staff, the Vice Chief. And I was, it was a real privilege, actually, privileged to be part of the Secretariat team that can trace its lineage back to the Secretary of the Chief of Staff in Winston Churchill's time as Prime Minister. There's a direct kind of linkage there. So if you look at some of those old photos, you can see the Secretary alongside the Chiefs and Winston Churchill and those leaders at that time. So that was a super cool job. But I did that at a time when the National Security Capability Review was happening. So I've kind of seen one of these from the inside and what it looks like. So last year we had the Strategic Defence Review, and that was a document that was authored by some, I suppose, what were classed as external consultants, but they really weren't. They were definitely trusted inside the tent, people with bags of experience.
I'm not sure Richard Barons would love being called an external consultant to the MOD these days, but
I think technically though, yeah. But anyway, but the point is that you had these recommendations that were made, uncosted, so agnostic of what they would cost, to say this is what we think the future of defence needs to look like. And there's some big headlines in there, particularly things we were interested in, investment in cyber, but also a whole bit around digital enabling technology, which is sort of linked, and then some broader things around what the big headline threats and capabilities might look like. But importantly, it's not a plan, it's a review, it's a set of recommendations, it's uncosted, and to a large extent, undeliverable in the form that it was released. So what then happens is, through the usual machinery of government process, there is a set of spending rounds, spending reviews, and these are chunked up differently with different departments at different times. But ultimately, they have to answer the question of how much money does a given department have to spend? What is its spending envelope? At big cross-government level, they have to decide where that money is coming from and how that is going to be resourced. And then within the Ministry of Defence, this is the really important part, is then there's a question of how do we map that spending envelope against a series of capabilities, programs, ships, tanks, aircraft, people, enabling functions, all the various cybers, all the various capital and resource costs that make up what our armed forces and our broader Ministry of Defence, and also some of the related things like elements of the intelligence apparatus, are able to do. Everyone has got very excited about this plan for a couple of reasons. One, it's been delayed. So I think everyone would have preferred to see Defence Investment Plan come really quickly off the back of the SDR, that showed a direct linkage between, okay, here was the recommendations, here's a costed plan of how we're going to get to those, or not, but here are the reasons why. So it's been delayed for probably realistically 12 months where it needed to be. It's caused headlines because it's controversial. So, and this is one of the really sort of fascinating things about government, I think, is if you ask general public, what are their concerns about? I don't doubt that it'd be things like immigration, cost of living, cost of fuel, NHS, all of these things are going to be top of their priorities. For people like us who've been inside government or inside some of these more privileged positions, and frankly still keep a close eye on what's going on in the world, then we understand that there's a bit more to be concerned about out there beyond those immediate day-to-day things. Not to talk those things down, because of course everyone's primary focus is what affects them and their family, and rightly so. But there is a bigger picture. So if we look at obviously the war in Ukraine, what happened in the Middle East, but also all the things that don't even make the news. What's happening in Sudan, what's happening in parts of South America, and the rise of populism there. And you start to add up all of those things. It's not even mentioning China, Taiwan, and that part of the world. Then you realize the world is a pretty sketchy place, and we'll probably come back to that. So it's controversial because there's a difference of opinion in different parts of government about what the priorities are. And that really played out very publicly between John Healey, the former Defence Secretary, and the Treasury, as it always does. I actually wrote a paper when I was at Staff College on defence reviews over the years, and they all follow a very similar pattern, which is ultimately the dispute between the Ministry of Defence and the Treasury, because they've got very different priorities and focus. So there's that. And then you overlay all that, the final bit of context, which is the fact that Keir Starmer has resigned as Prime Minister. This is probably going to be his last big policy act, I suspect, because Parliament's going to rise pretty soon, and everything's pointing towards we'll have a coronation of Andy Burnham as new Prime Minister. So it's got a lot of attention, probably far more than this kind of plan normally would. But just to bring it right back to where some of the people watching this might care about, on the assumption that people in our kind of broader orbit are listening to this or watching this, is for the defence supply chain, the lack of a plan, the lack of a clear funded envelope has been a real challenge over the past 12 months, because it affects confidence, it affects follow-on supply chains, it affects investment, and even to the point that we've heard stories of really quite big companies going bust because they didn't have the investment secured, because there was no plan coming out of government. So I think lots of people care about this for different reasons, but it's definitely controversial. Sorry, that was probably a longer answer than it needed to be, but I thought it was a good set of context.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's important to go over all of that, because you're right. There is a lot of kind of focus on this defense investment plan, and for specific and good reason, right? I think there's a lot of things going on. I come back to the thing that I always say: this is the most dangerous time since the Cold War. So it's unsurprising that we need to really focus our efforts on how we're going to expend the treasury, the treasure of the nation, on the defense of the nation, right? So I think it's right to set the context of all of that. So I really appreciate you getting into that. So broadly speaking, SDR kind of talks about what the future force needs to look like, and DIP talks about how we're going to spend money to get there. Is that roughly it?
Yeah, it is. That said, even since the SDR, the context has changed again with what's happened in Iran, with what has happened either side of the Atlantic, and statements around NATO and Greenland, and all of these things have happened since the SDR was published. So these things are always going to be a moment in time, and that's part of the challenge of the DIP. Is this need to set a multi-year funding envelope in a really, really dynamic, rapidly changing scenario, which is why some of the judgments around the way that we will spend the money, not what we're going to spend it on, but the way that it will be spent, become really important, and we should definitely come back to that.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned the year in between, roughly a year between the SDR and the release of the DIP today, and I think that year just really highlights the enormous complexity in which the UK is trying to kind of thread a whole bunch of needles right now, in terms of economy, in terms of finances, in terms of defense, in terms of our relationship with Europe, in terms of the transatlantic relationship, at a time when, as Mark Carney likes to say, we're in a rupture, not a transition, in global world orders, right? So I think that year provides a bit of testimony there. But okay, let's move off of that now for a second, and focus on the kind of headline statements. And I should say, the full text of the defense investment plan hasn't been released yet. So I haven't gone through this in detail. So we'll make a few kind of headline kind of assessments just based on what the Prime Minister said earlier today, alongside the Chancellor of the Exchequer and the still wondering where his office is, Dan Jarvis, the Defence Secretary, and some of the statements that have come out on the gov.uk website, specifically kind of highlighting the headline kind of level. So let's go over the headline level. So the first thing to say is it looks like 15 billion of extra investment. So that's an important thing, right? So our armed forces were already committed with a committed spend package over the next 4 years. This is 15 billion on top of that, taking the total to nearly 300 billion. And I think it's important to note that that is by far the largest investment in our armed forces since the mid 80s, when the Cold War was still on, when we still had a very large Soviet nuclear threat that was not far away. And I recognize that Glasnost and Perestroika were starting around then, but broadly speaking, this is the biggest investment in our armed forces since the 1980s. That's, as the Prime Minister said, almost half a century ago, which is not insignificant. All of that said, it falls short of the roughly 28 billion that I think Al Carnes and John Healey were looking for. I say them, but the ministries for which they were representing. So the other kind of headline statement that the Prime Minister liked to kind of put into bright lights was he was talking about, in fact, I think it was the Chancellor was talking about 60,000 extra direct and indirect jobs that were coming from this new uplift in investment, this 15 billion. And what that was meaning was, I read that in a way that I think the Chancellor and the soon outgone Prime Minister are looking at two things. One is they're looking at increasing the investment in our armed forces to increase our national security. As Rachel Reeves said, national security is economic security, and I think those two things are tied. I think that the inverse is meaningful as well. Economic security is national security, but those two things are intrinsically tied. But I think they're looking to make sure that this 15 billion is actually going to be used in a way that actually increases the UK's hard power. That's a good investment. That is a virtuous objective. But I also think that they are hoping that 60,000 extra jobs and a lot of kind of focus on AI, which we'll get into the form of the defense investment plan in a second. But I think they're hoping that that investment in some way catalyzes some more growth of the UK economy at a time when we're struggling to grow, and specifically looking at tools like AI to help the UK with its productivity, which is, our economy's been slow in growing, but our productivity has been tremendously slow at growing broadly since 2008. And I have my own views on austerity and what that meant for our productivity. But by and large, we've been struggling to grow in terms of productivity. So those are the headline statements. Anything to add there, Dave?
I think that's right. There's a bit in there about some realisms of this. So there's a bit of a hint of where the money's coming from. So talk of some of the projects being scrapped or delayed, but not a lot of detail on that out yet. But I do think it's important to lay out that these are hard choices. There isn't we all remember the old magic money tree from whichever government it was. These are difficult choices that have to be made. So I think that's important. And then, more broadly, there's the sort of the content of it. But I guess we'll get onto that in a minute, which is to say, what is actually in there.
Yeah, I think we should spend a bit of time kind of delving into that a little bit. One of the things that I wanted to kind of focus on was there's a lot of talk about percentage of GDP and how much of our GDP is going to this. Personally, I can see why there's a lot of focus on this, not least of which NATO commitments and Donald Trump and et cetera, et cetera. Personally, I prefer to focus on the real numbers rather than the percentage of GDP numbers. I personally think it's a bit of a red herring to measure in that way. What I'd rather do is look at the Strategic Defense Review, look at the Defense Investment Plan, and see if those two things measure up. Because the Strategic Defense Review, written by people that I have an awful lot of faith in their ability to clearly articulate what the nation needs in terms of its national security, and the Defense Investment Plan is, that's the real stuff. That's the actual stuff that's going to make a difference, rather than kind of big P politics headline statements about percentages of GDP. So let me ask you the million pound several billion
15 billion pound question. Yeah.
let me ask you the 15 billion pound question. Is it enough, Dave?
Well, I'll come back to my point about hard choices. All right. So anyone who manages any budget, whether you're managing your household budget or you're managing 300 billion pounds, I would suggest has the ability to use that budget and to live to those means. There is a long-standing criticism, and Al Carnes was quite scathing about this after he stepped down, about how the Ministry of Defence spends its money. And I would strongly agree with that.
It's not just to interrupt. And like you come from the Ministry of Defense, I come from an intelligence background. I would suggest that not spending in the smartest way is not something that is unique to the Ministry of Defense.
No, and look, I mean, this is a whole other conversation around the way in which public money is spent, and there's a whole other thing there. So we're not going down that hill. So there's a bit of that. There's a bit of it'll be spent how it's spent, and it will be spent. It will be used to do stuff. I think the bigger question for me is it going to buy the right things, and is it going to be spent in the right way in terms of the kinds of capabilities that are going to be procured? Because it's always going to be a choice. You could always have another squadron of jets, or you could always have another warship if you had the money, or whatever it might be, whichever uniform or lobbying group or industry body kind of gets their way. Actually, I think it's more important to say, are we making sensible judgments about what we think the future character of warfare is going to be? And I use that word very deliberately. And you might hear, just very briefly, you might hear people like Dan Jarvis use the words the character of warfare. And there's a bit of a phrase, which I'm sure you've heard before, Steve, but others might not, which is the nature of warfare never changes. The nature of warfare, that it is a violent human activity that is about exerting your will on the enemy. And whether you go to Sun Tzu or Clausewitz or whichever military philosopher, they will all agree that the nature of warfare is unchanging. But the character of war absolutely changes.
So, sorry, just to interrupt. I mean, it was von Clausewitz that said,
"Yeah, exactly.
War is a continuation of politics by other means, right?"
Yeah,
so it is politics being played out, just with much more violent kind of means.
So there's the really specific phrase where people say the character of war is changing.
Yeah.
And I would argue that the character of war is changing at a pace now enabled by technology that it probably never has before. So in short periods, of the Second World War and the First World War for that matter, you saw amazing innovations, the tank, for example, the machine gun, things that changed. They did change the character of war, and they changed it singularly overnight. But then there was an adaptation to that over a period of time.
Yeah.
What we're seeing now is that cycle is now in days and weeks of new technology, adoption, changes in tactics, and then something else comes along straight after it. And that is all accelerated and accelerating as AI becomes more and more sophisticated and more embedded. So I think that is a roundabout way of saying, I think that some of the themes that are emerging are good ones. And then it remains to be seen how the sort of transformation in the Ministry of Defence, the Defence Reform Project, which John Healey kicked off, one, does that survive contact with at least one change of Defence Secretary, possibly another one in a few weeks, who knows, whether, assuming it's Andy Burnham, will keep Dan Jarvis on or not. And then how that then is put into action to actually spend the money with defence industry and with maybe different kinds of defence companies. And again, we can come back to that. Probably it's a good place to finish.
Well, I mean, that's really interesting, right? So there's a bunch of things there. What you're saying is there's a thing about the amount of money, but there's also a thing about how you use that money and how you spend that money. And I think that's a really important point to make, and to highlight the fact that the evidence suggests that we've not been great in the past at kind of outlaying taxpayers' funds in ways that are ridiculously effective. I've seen it work really well, by the way. It's not all bad, right? But it's certainly that the case that there's lessons that we can learn and we can always do better. I think.
But we've also seen it done really badly as well. If I just remember the pictures of £2.3 billion worth of Nimrod MRA4s being literally bulldozed because we decided to cancel that program at exactly the wrong point. So I think that that was a hard choice, but it resulted in a big capability gap for a long time and the waste of a lot of money.
Yeah, and that's there's all kinds of anecdotes about places where things can be better. And I do want to point out that there are some good things, but there are certainly some bad things. I guess what I'd say is I think that you talk about the character of war, and I really like that phrase. I will say one of the things that struck me over and over was how much the prime minister pointed to the lessons that are being learned in Ukraine. He specifically highlighted the fact that Ukraine destroyed the Black Sea Fleet without a navy of their own, and these kind of really headline statements. I think the thing that I wanted to kind of take a moment to reflect on and to get your thoughts on are, I always say that Ukrainian security and Ukrainian defense is European defense. And I don't mean EU, I mean European defense. And we talk about lessons in these types of press briefings as if they're just like, oh, we've read some papers and we've learned some lessons. The reality is right now, in a very contested front line, Ukrainians are paying for those lessons with their blood and lives, right? Ukrainian heroes are helping us to learn the lessons, and they're doing it with their lives and their society, right? And I never want to take away from the fact that yes, we're learning lessons, but people are having to pay for those lessons in the hard way.
I think that's a really good point. And I heard that's something really interesting. I can't remember exactly what forum it was in, but it was something talking about kind of defense tech founders and startups and investments. And I heard a really interesting phrase, which was, in fact, to tell you, it was a DSEI last year. It was DSEI in September last year. And somebody said, if you developed some kind of new, particularly uncrewed vehicle type technology, and you're looking to sell it to NATO, and it's not being used in Ukraine, forget it. Forget it. Because that's where things are being tested, and that's where the capability will prove itself. Now, there's a really important point about learning lessons, which is you've got to learn the right ones. And what we are learning in Ukraine is what land warfare looks like in 2026, what land warfare looks like in the information age, largely. You mentioned the Black Sea Fleet. That's absolutely a fair point. And I think the Navy actually probably has learned some of those lessons. This pivot to a hybrid Navy, recognition that you don't need lots of huge crewed platforms to take on other crewed platforms. You can do it in very asymmetric ways. Great. Just put that to one side, because it is a bit part in the whole thing, an important part, but it's a bit part. What Ukraine really is a land war between two peer adversaries in a way that we have not seen at the scale since the Second World War. So that's what we're learning about, is what does that look like? That is not the only kind of conflict that is going to happen, or even arguably is happening right now. So what we mustn't do is become so focused on what is happening 50 kilometers either side of the front line in Ukraine that it obscures everything else. I'm not saying that's what's happened at the dip at all, but I think, again, it's just learning that's part of the lesson. But there are a whole bunch of other lessons from Ukraine. Energy security is just such a huge one. And I mean that in a number of ways. I mean, your access to a secure source of energy which you own and control, but I also mean the resilience of your energy network and your ability to defend it against a whole range of threats, from hypersonic missiles to cyber attacks to sabotage. And I'm not convinced, with everything I've heard this morning thus far, again, caveat, not read the full text of the dip, that it's going to cover all that ground. It feels a little bit like, and I'm going to be a little bit cynical here, I said earlier on about the delay of the dip. So broadly a year in development. John Healy fell on his sword. Al Kahns fell on his sword because they weren't convinced by it. They then had approximately 2 weeks, I think, with Dan Jarvis in charge, maybe 3 maximum, but about 2 weeks, I think, to come up with a new dip, which has got much more of a focus on drones and uncrewed systems, which is great. But my slight worry is those are shiny headline deliverables, and the analysis might not be as deep as it could be behind them. To ask the really difficult questions around what is it that we are defending against? What are we defending, and what are we defending it against? Because that's a really difficult question.
Well, and I think that's a really good segue to get into the detail of the form and format of the dip and like what it looks like, and we'll cover that in a second. What I will say is General Barron's the one of the authors of the Strategic Defense Review last year was on talking to the ever awesome Anna Foster this morning on Radio 4. And he wasn't scathing. He wasn't really kind of critical of it. He was just saying in his professional opinion, the composition and the overall headline numbers of the dip don't go far enough to protect against the nation as he and others laid out in the Strategic Defense Review last year. So I found that really interesting. But coming on to the composition point, again, I'll quickly go over the headlines. I'm just going to look this way just because my notes are over here. So $8 billion for GCAP, the Global Combat Air Program, over the next 4 years. That's the thing that we're doing with Japan and Italy. And if I had my way, Canada would be in there as well. $63 billion over the next 4 years for the nuclear deterrent. And I was really interested to hear, there were a couple things here. One is Dreadnought, the future kind of nuclear deterrent submarine that we want to launch. The SSN, but also a bunch of F-35As. So different than the F-35s that are on the carriers that we've got right now. So these are nuclear capable of dropping free fall nuclear bombs. But also, and this is the one that I found really interesting, a new warhead, a British designed nuclear warhead. So that was something. So there's 63 billion in there for that. There's 26 billion for revamping Faslane, Portsmouth, and Devonport. Again, a real reflection of the fact that the UK has a long history of having a fantastic world-class Royal Navy, and we need to continue to invest in that. 5 billion over the next 4 years for those drone transformation program of the armed forces, which is what you mentioned. 2 billion for defense targeting web, digital targeting web, something that I think is really interesting. AI has got to be featuring in that, although I would suggest that there are some lessons that we can be learning from Iran in this. 790 million over the next 4 years to protect overseas and UK bases from drones and missiles. And we're talking about directed energy weapons and counter UAVs and things like that. 11 billion on munitions. Sounds dreadfully boring and unsexy. What I would suggest is that having fantastic world-class weapons platforms without anything to fire or drop is a pretty expensive exercise in creating paperweights. So unsexy, but meaningful and important. 900 million to drive efficiency and reform procurement. So I'm really interested to see what that is, because that really then kind of comes to the point that you were making, is that it's not just about how much, but how you spend it. And 100 million for the Prime Minister's Rapid AI Delivery Task Force, RAID. That's a very American way of developing an acronym for let's call it RAID, and figure out what that needs to be in the backplane. So those are the headline kind of compositional statements. I'm just curious to see what your thoughts are.
Well, so I think the majority of that would already have been in the plan. So I think there's something in the presentation of it that has been skewed, because actually the first things that were announced were not necessarily the biggest. So GCAP, maybe it's the single biggest investment. I think there has been the biggest single pivot that has at least been sort of announced is the deletion of a direct replacement for the Type 45 destroyer, and a replacement with a selection of uncrewed and crewed platforms to like the so-called hybrid navy. I think that's a really good idea. I do. The one caveat I'll say is the Type 45 is the most capable air defense capability we've got at the moment. Full stop. I'm not just talking about maritime, I'm talking about anywhere. One incredible air defense approach is to park a Type 45 in the Thames somewhere, and as far up as you can get it, and then use that as an air defense.
This is what they tried to do. This is what they tried to do in Cyprus when.
Yeah, correct. Yeah.
When there was thoughts that the Iranians were going to be lobbing all kinds of Shahad drones at Cyprus, and we need to get a Type 45 there. Now, don't get me wrong, it took us a while to get it there, but I think that was testimony to exactly what you're saying, right? The Type 45 as an air defense platform is an incredibly capable platform.
Yeah, but I think what we're starting to get towards is recognition across all of the areas, whether it's the autonomous, I don't know, the autonomous wingman. Because that's not the right word, but the collaborative combat aircraft.
Loyal wingman, the American.
Yeah, collaborative combat aircraft, I think is best.
Yeah, that's it.
Which will form part of a broader air capability, whether it's the maritime stuff I've mentioned, whether it's the various uncrewed platforms of land environment. I think it's recognizing that it's not just about crewed versus uncrewed. It's about scale. It's about mass. It's about variation. It's about the ability to have everything from really small scale, really cheap, attritable throwaway platforms. And let's not forget that the Ukrainians are using very small scale drones in their thousands every day, producing 4 million a year, 4 million drones a year, producing or consuming, right up to retaining some of those exquisite platforms that can do the highest end missions. So I think broadly, that feels about right. I think there'll be some things in there that people can get excited about, both positively and negatively. I'm sure that there'll be elements of the Navy jumping up and down that they're not going to get a new destroyer. I see Tom Sharp, who writes in various papers, who I worked with a few years ago, top bloke, but he's very, very much dark blue line, as you would expect, for former Royal Navy officer. And I think he was, saying broadly, agreeing with some of the decisions, but there were the bits that concerned him, which is to be expected. There's an element of, is it right to be investing so much money in a single crewed air platform? I think, while the Royal Air Force is run by pilots, then that's, always going to be elements of it, but that's a whole other thing. But I think, there's some good stuff in there. And I think where it's probably worth finishing then, the last couple of minutes, is talking about a bit about what it means for business, and then maybe what it means for us specifically.
Before we go there, I just wanted to state one thing that I am getting slightly excited about, and unfortunately it is in the negative, which I didn't see anything in there about cyber, either defensive cyber or the National Cyber Force. The program that we've been working very hard over the last kind of 12 to 15 years to turn from a early stage national offensive cyber program, which I have a lot of history with personally, but also taking that and transforming it as it should, as a change program, into the artist that is now the National Cyber Force. And I haven't seen anything. Now, again, I'm going to come back to, we haven't seen the full text of the DIP yet, so hopefully there's something in there. But the SDR very clearly laid out that cyber has to be part of, both defensive and offensive cyber have to be part of our future defense. And I'm slightly worried about the fact that nothing I've seen so far, either in the Prime Minister's speech, alongside the Chancellor and the Defense Secretary, but also in the questions afterwards, it wasn't picked up on. So that's only one thing in terms of composition that I'm slightly worried about. But let's see what the DIP has to say in the full text.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, in the context of what is going to attract the public's attention, what is going to make headlines in newspapers, what is going to catch the eye of the selector, as it were, I don't think cyber's it. I think it's too confusing. It's too ethereal. For the majority of people, you can't stand in front of it and announce it. You can't, as the Prime Minister did, point to his left and to his right to the drones that were sort of flanking his position on the lectern. You can with the cyber, unless you point to a laptop.
It's just pointing to some pimple-faced kid named Simon. It probably doesn't have the same impact as standing next to a drone, right?
This will need an IT crowd sketch, isn't it?
There's a Richard Ayoade thing in there somewhere.
Yeah. Yeah. So I mean, let's see what it comes out. I do share your trepidation on that front, so we'll see what it comes out.
Yeah. All right. So sorry, I interrupted you. You were about to start talking about business. I mean, what are your thoughts on this?
Well, so I think I come back to my previous point about how the money is spent. All right. So one of the issues which has ever been the case is the defence sector is a really hard landscape for SMEs because risk appetite in government is generally low, whether it's commercially or whatever else. Complexity is high. Risks on the business side are high, so it's been difficult historically. There's been a lot of statements around this recently. A lot of doing things like establishing the Defence Office for Small Business Growth, establishing defence innovation to kind of wrap in some of the disparate bits of the innovation ecosystem that have been around before. Because we've done some work with that through JADIS Allies and the NATO Diana work.
Yeah.
But I still think it's difficult for business. So the sort of headline statements around this idea of buy British, invest in the supply chain, just specifically said, invest in startups and SMEs. Great. think we've got to see then what that looks like and the mechanisms of how that money is going to flow. And the right answer can't be chuck a bunch of money at the primes and says, it'd be jolly nice if you would spend some of this with the SME community. Because the reality is they do anyway, but they do that by either putting big margins on because they then transfer the risk out of government. They do it by acquiring innovative companies and folding them into their corporate machine so they get the capability, but maybe lose some of the agility and innovation. There has to be a better way of doing this. And, a good friend of mine, Blythe Crawford, now working at Tiberius Aerospace on the Grail platform. And again, we're doing some work with those guys. There's some ideas there around defense as a service and ecosystems of small companies and really driving innovation that looks far more like kind of Silicon Valley software startup than it does traditional manufacturing behemoth like BAE Systems. And the reality is, if you want a warship, or you want an aircraft with the complexity of Tempest, you're going to have to go to defense prime because you don't want to. But we don't. What we specifically said in this plan is it doesn't have to be all about warships and exquisite platforms. It's about a mix. It's about the high-low mix, as my friend Blythe would say. And in that area, we have to get out there and spend this money with startups, invest in new companies, create the environment such that the new entrants can get into the sector, get those innovative capabilities into the hands of the warfighter. It's such a trite phrase, but it is correct, because that, for me, is the lesson from Ukraine. That's the lesson that we should be really thinking about, not what it looks like immediately over the battle space and whether it's fiber optic or RF drones. Great, those are all things that feed in. But the fundamental thing that is different in Ukraine is the cycle of development and the delegation of that development to a very, very low level, because the reality is one unit operating one part of the front line has a very different requirement than one operating not that far away. And they just need the stuff right there today to help them. What they don't need is to write a requirements document that goes through years of scrutiny before it eventually lands in a capability that's too late, too expensive, and no longer fit for purpose. That's the key lesson.
Well, indeed. But then the counter argument to that is, sure, but we need capabilities that are scalable, integratable, durable, right? Like so. This is the character that you were talking about, right? It's all of these things all mixed together into some hard choices that I think we're going to have to be making over the next little while. Right. This risks running into a marathon if we keep going at this pace, and you could probably hear an aircraft taking off just over there. One of the joys of living in Gloucestershire is that Staverton Airport is just over there. Busiest general aviation airport in the United Kingdom, I'll have you know.
There you go. Full of facts.
Full of facts. None of them really mean anything, but right. Let's end it there, Dave. It's been really fascinating talking to you about this. I think over the next little while, it's going to be interesting to see the full text of the DIP. And I think for most people, it probably is boring reading, but for us, we're pretty excited to get our head around it and see what the full text has to say. Because from a national security perspective, this is at least as, if not more, relevant than the SDR last year.
Yeah, I think that's right. So we shall see what comes out in due course.
We shall indeed. Right. Well, thank you everybody for listening. And apologies for the slightly wayward format. Hopefully that worked for everybody. But we'll see you next time. See ya.
Yep. Speak soon. Bye-bye.